As I said at the beginning, my ministry, generally speaking, is behind the scenes, facilitating the messages from people who actually know what they're doing. But every once in a while, I find that I have something to say. And in my opinion, having something to say and not saying it is far worse than having nothing to say at all. I usually do a talk once a year, and they're always inspired by my Habitat trips. This one's no different. I started writing it in my head when I was up on Cape Croker on the Chippewas of Nawash First Nation. Ironically, had it not been for the pandemic and the lockdown, I would be headed back up to that reserve next weekend to spend another week up there building. Next weekend happens to be Indigenous Peoples Day in Canada, which was the point of starting the build on that day, and I was very much looking forward to being up there for that. It's just another unfortunate casualty of COVID-19. Before I get to the main part of my message, I wanted to take a moment to talk about a little bit about what's happening in the world at this time with regard to the battle against systemic racism. As a privileged white male, I obviously know nothing about the injustices faced by people of color, or anyone else for that matter. All I really know is that I want every human being with whom we share this world to have every opportunity without bias. And I know that's very far from the reality for so many people. I've never really had to think about matters of racism other than having a general privileged Canadian, we're too good to be racist sort of point of view. I still remember very vividly a few years ago during a meeting of the community support team that I chaired at work. One of the team members, lovely person inside and out, who's obviously of Indian or Pakistani descent, she referred to herself in conversation as a person of color. And I was, for no good reason, kind of floored. And to be honest, I was oddly a little offended by the fact that in that venue, she would refer to our differences. It was kind of a pivotal moment for me that highlighted how systemic racism is perpetuated. People like me aren't even cognizant of its continued existence until we're reminded by those for whom it's a daily reality. And that's why the current protests are so very important. It puts the systemic issues right in our face, where it belongs. So I encourage everybody to think deeply about these issues and read and study and participate and help. As I said, I'm not qualified to talk about racial issues, but in thinking about them, some of it is shaped by what is the theme of my message this morning. So let's get to it. Last year's trip was my 5th build away with Habitat for Humanity. And as always, it was a profoundly enriching experience. These trips are an amazing experience for a number of reasons. They're an opportunity to help people who obviously need it. They're an opportunity to see other places and to see other circumstances that are very much different than our own. And they're an opportunity to be part of a team of people who are at that moment being their best selves. They've stepped away from their everyday lives at some personal sacrifice to help people in need, purely altruistic. I don't have great religious learning, but what I can do is share a few stories from these trips and to use them as examples of what I think is important for us to consider. The theme of my musing this morning is 3 favorite verbs. If you look in the dictionary, these aren't actually verbs, so my English teacher daughter is going to hate this, but in my opinion, none of these words have life unless they inspire and describe action. So I think of them as verbs. The words I'm talking about are faith, compassion, and love. The news this past year, even before the pandemic hit, has been full of hateful political discourse in which compassion is lost to tribalism and faith is weaponized and love is altogether absent for those who don't share the same opinions. But at the same time, there are lots of examples that run counter to that, where our better angels shine and humanity shows its better face. That better face is what we learn in this place from the time we're children. But it seems like sometimes that gets lost out in the real world. But that better faith is what leads us to join service clubs and to work with charities and to care for one another in myriad ways. It's what leads people to street-level ministry, like the Embrace Center in Fort Erie. And what's led me to an active role in the YWCA and the Red Cross and Habitat for Humanity. I'm sure when I do one of these talks, I make the professional preachers wince because I refuse to talk about religion. Religion is a human construct, and in my experience, it has all too often very little to do with God and very little to do with faith. Religion has led to wars and discrimination, but faith, truthfully applied, and the actions that it requires and inspires, that's what I'm interested in pondering and celebrating, and to be honest, living. Faith is what generates and requires compassion and love for our fellow citizens of this remarkable gift that we call Earth. There's a great quote that I use probably too often from an unknown author that says, "Be careful how you live. You may be the only Bible some people ever read." I've been in places where I was part of a very, very small Christian minority. We weren't there to evangelize. We were there to act in the way that our faith requires that we act. What better demonstration of faith is there than to quietly do God's work in service to people that we will likely never see again? There's another anonymous quote I like that says, "Always judge someone by the way they treat someone who can be of no possible use to them." That's what I admire so much about my compatriots who travel overseas with aid agencies like Habitat. And not just Habitat, there's a lot of people doing good work out there. They're there to help people who are of no possible use to them. They are simply there out of a completely altruistic sense of compassion. My first trip with Habitat was to the Philippines in 2015. That was the year after Typhoon Haiyan devastated so much of their territory and killed thousands of their citizens. And we spent 2 weeks working on a housing complex in Daan Bantayan, which was largely leveled by the storm. We spent some time with some local school children there. I never forget the response of one little girl when she was asked what they did during the storm. Her family huddled together on the floor of their hut and prayed. It's one thing to see storms like that on the news. It's another thing entirely to hear from the mouths of babes how they were affected directly. But it is a remarkable thing to have the opportunity to help make it right. That is the love and compassion that our faith requires. I'm probably going to embarrass somebody that was on that first trip and has been with me on subsequent trips as well. But he's an example of love and compassion lived in action in a way most of us wouldn't even think of. I didn't know it at the time, but turns out one of my teammates volunteers with search and rescue out west in an area of harsh and dangerous terrain. That is really nothing short of heroic. And I'm very proud to consider him a friend. Most of us can only dream of daring to live our love for others in a way like that boldly. My second Habitat trip was to a slum outside of Delhi, India. We worked on a home for a Muslim family, and the home we were building, which was a considerable upgrade from where they were before, totaled about 180 square feet. Many of us have a living room larger than that whole home, but it would give them security and safety from the weather and appropriate sanitation. And trust me, sanitation is a huge concern in that country. And there's a lesson here that is beyond the scope of our ability to conceive. One of the dangers for that young family that we were building the home for, they have several daughters, and those daughters are in great danger when they have to go and use the communal washrooms at night. They have to put themselves at risk to go and use the washroom. The homes that Habitat builds have a toilet in the home, so the children no longer have to go out and put themselves in danger for the simple act of going to the bathroom. Another side benefit to traveling to faraway lands is the opportunity, of course, to see some remarkable pieces of their culture outside of the build. It still amazes me that I have visited the Taj Mahal and to have stood at the place where Gandhi died. Trip 3 in 2017 gave me a demonstration of compassion on a level that I'll never be able to forget. We were in a rural area of Nepal, building a home for a family in desperate need. The family we were building for was of a lower caste, and there was virtually no opportunity for the man to find work. The mother was crippled from the waist down, and they had a young daughter to take care of. They lived in a hut behind the home that we were building for them. I'll show you a picture in a minute, but I need to build up to that. And I will tell you, though, that their circumstances were dire. We spent some time with a village elder who was very proud to tell us that the community was supporting the building of the home for them. Normally, Habitat requires that the homeowner contribute a certain amount of sweat equity and that they be able to repay for the home at an appropriate rate. But in this case, the community was providing those things. In that area, that was a very progressive thing, and he was rightly very proud of his community. Not very long after we got home from the build, we got a picture of the airport in NIagara, which we had flown into to do the build, flooded in the monsoon rains. Now, here's a picture of the hut that the family was living in before. Picture living in that hut during monsoon season. When some of the world's people live in circumstances like that, in comparison to what we consider normal, you can see why I take the opportunity to do these talks and to show people these stories. Love and compassion need to extend universally and equitably, and they do not. My 2018 trip was to Curve Lake First Nation, and the first day of the build was spent not building, but sitting in the band offices, listening to their band historian, and learning a little bit about their beliefs, and learning a little bit about some of the treaty issues that Indigenous peoples have faced in North America. One thing that came up that I'd never really thought deeply about was that the treaties are between the Indigenous peoples and all of us as Canadian citizens, not just our government. We're all treaty peoples. The government signed the treaties on our behalf as our representatives, committing us to those treaties. I find it deeply concerning that we have found billions of dollars to help our citizens weather the pandemic, rightly so, but we've never been able to find the money to provide safe drinking water to hundreds of reserves. That is not honoring our treaty obligations. That is not demonstrating love and compassion for our Indigenous brethren. We talk much about reconciliation in Canada, but we need the words to be followed by action. On last year's trip, we spent some time in the woods with one of the elders, talking about their beliefs, some of the medicines in the forest, and learning a bit about their attitudes to the land and nature. It was a remarkable opportunity to learn, and I wish more people would have the opportunity to study the Indigenous sense of oneness with the land and the plants and the animals, and learn how we might live sustainably. Instead of forcing our Indigenous forefathers off their land onto reserves, if we had spent some time learning from them, we would be much better stewards of this beautiful land. But it seems like our sense of compassion and love for them as fellow humans was completely overruled by our greed for their land's bounty. And that is a sad, sad thing. I've really only scratched the surface as far as examples of love and compassion in action, as I've seen them demonstrated so many times on my Habitat trips. I'm not by any stretch of the imagination saying that the only way to show love and compassion for your fellow man is to go to the other side of the world and do something grand. there's loads of opportunity all around us. The news tends to focus on trouble and strife, but if we open our eyes and look around, we are surrounded by humanity's better angels. We only hear about bad cops, but there are vastly more good ones out there. Firemen, doctors, nurses, all the frontline medical personnel, search and rescue volunteers and professionals. It was horrifying a week or so ago that one of our firefighters rescuing somebody from the Niagara River in the gorge was swept away in the river. Thank God he was rescued successfully. The following week, a young man was lost in the river, has not yet been found. People that put themselves at risk to rescue others are a demonstration of love and compassion in action that I cannot top. We have heard a lot lately about negligent circumstances at long-term care homes. And I'll admit from my experience with my parents that it is very much a problem. But the fact is that there are many caring professionals and volunteers out there caring for our infirm and elderly. And we need to recognize that even while we push for changes to the system. My work with the YWCA and other agencies has brought me into contact with many, many people who serve on the front line caring for those less fortunate in our society. The love and compassion they demonstrate in action is nothing short of inspiring. And there's endless other examples. I hope when we look around we can see all the good and potential good that exists and let that inspire us to address the bad things that exist alongside the good. If we truly make love and compassion words of action, it shapes everything. It shapes our attitudes to race, to poverty, to homelessness. It shapes our response to COVID-19. In our desire to get back to normal, we have to temper that with our compassion and regard for others to avoid putting them at risk. And it should shape our response to climate change. Love and compassion can't just consider ourselves. We have to include future generations to whom we will be handing a planet in crisis if we don't learn to care for this world in a sustainable way. I know that my thoughts about love and compassion and faith are not shared by everybody. I think those are the things that are lacking in the world that have led us to where we are. I really hope that some of the current wave of protests leads to real sustained change. Currently, the flames are around Black Lives Matter, and certainly that's a fire that needs to be addressed and hopefully will be addressed. But when that's over, I hope that we can root out more and more of the systemic biases that pervade this world. There are many ways to demonstrate love and compassion in the world, and there are many different faiths and many ways of expressing those faiths. But since compassion is written into the song each faith sings, I hope that we can move ever closer to the world our Creator intended for us. Thank you.